So, I want to talk with you today about systems thinking and how we really need to meet the challenge of getting real in this work. And, so many of you have talked with me about the challenge that you're facing when it comes to figuring out exactly how to get leverage on the problems that you want to address out there in the world. And this is really a big issue because if you apply your effort at the wrong leverage point or a place that is not strategic, you can you can work your butt off and still not make a difference when it comes to the vision that you have for making change out in the world. And I know from my own experience, when I look back on some of my efforts as an advocate, as a change agent, that in the end didn't really achieve the result that I wanted, so often it was because I hadn't actually done a real systems analysis before I began engaging in that change effort. And so, what we want to do today is really talk about different ways of approaching that. And one tool, particularly, that I want to focus on and walk you through is something called root cause analysis. And that is a particular form of systems thinking. And I found it to be just a great shortcut, if you will. It has so many of the benefits of really looking at a system and drilling down to the bedrock and the root cause. But unlike some of the really ornate stuff from MIT and symbolic logic around systems thinking, this is actually something that you can use in the real world. And so let's walk through that. But before we do that, I want to just give you an overview of different approaches to thinking that you want to have in mind as you're going about your work. And we've really found that great change agents use three tools when they're really focused on getting real, facing reality, and finding the leverage to make change. And the first of these is systems thinking. And, we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But I also just want you to be aware that also you want to be thinking about critical thinking. This is really useful for understanding yourself, your perspective, your identity, your role, and the systems you're seeking to change. And I'll mention that along the way. This is critical for you as a change agent. If you can't take your lens off and actually see the way that your perspective may be distorting your view of reality, you're really going to struggle when it comes to making change and achieving the vision that you want. And then another tool or way of thinking that can be so useful is design thinking. And this is useful for developing solutions that are more likely to stick because they're actually generated by the people who are closest to the challenge. So again, you want to be bearing in mind all three of these approaches. But what we want to do now is really get a little deeper on systems thinking and specifically this tool of root cause analysis. So systems thinking has been around, really the work of Peter Senge and others has brought it to the fore in the last maybe 30, 40 years. And there's a great book by Donella Meadows called Thinking in Systems, which is just a great introduction to this whole field. Well, why do we need systems thinking? I'll talk about that in a moment. But first, just to define what systems thinking is or how to even think about a system, this is a discipline that says every system is made up of three things. The first is just the components of the system, right? The different pieces. The second key aspect of a system is the interconnections between those different components. And then the third way to think about what a system is that there are outcomes that are reliably produced by that system. They're the system's functional result, no matter what someone says its intended purpose is. And this is a really key piece because a lot of times, particularly when we're trying to change aspects of society or engage in complex social change, you may encounter a system that says its purpose is to educate every student to a certain standard. But when you look at how it actually functions in the world, that's not the result that it achieves. And so systems thinking would tell you have to look at the actual outcome, not what the system says it's supposed to do or intending to do. You have to look at the actual outcome. So when is systems thinking actually helpful to us? Well, one of the times when you really want to pull this tool out is when you're encountering a problem that persists despite our best efforts to solve it. And unfortunately, many of the challenges that you all are taking on are just like that. They're persistent problems that lots of people have tried hard to solve over a long period of time, but they're still with us. Another reason or flag for you to think about, bringing systems thinking to bear is when there are unintended consequences that just seem to proliferate. That every time you do something or try to make some intervention to make things better, a bunch of other things start to go wrong. That's another sign that maybe there's a system at play with complexity and interconnection that you're not tracking. Another one is that, our brains are wired to use linear cause and effect. If A, then B. But in a complex system, that often just isn't true, and it's not reliable from, if A, then B. Every time you do A, you don't always get B. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. That's, again, another indication that you might want to bring out systems thinking, bring it to bear. The other reason to do it is just when things get too complex to keep track of it all. And this happens a lot. You just literally cannot process what's going on. Then you need to kind of use these tools to get some of this on paper so that you can really process it and make some decisions and craft your strategy. And then lastly, of course, is what I said before. When a system is consistently producing results that are different than what the system or the people representing that system say they're doing. And again, this happens a lot in the public arena where we have a criminal justice system, right? But the actual result of that may not be justice or may not be equal justice for all. So again, that's a trigger that we want to look deeper to understand what's really going on there, and particularly to figure out where we want to intervene for maximum effect. There's something else that you really have to keep in mind when you're beginning to use these tools of systems thinking, and that is that when you engage with a system, just inevitably you become a part of it. You cannot, as a philanthropist, an activist, any kind of a change maker, you don't have the illusion that you can be an independent actor. You see some solution from the outside and then you can just kind of make that happen, because the very act of intervening like that makes you a part of the system, even if you weren't a part of it before. And another piece is, guess what? Even if you think you had nothing to do with this system at the outset, chances are you actually, when we begin to sort of take it apart and look at the levels, chances are that there is actually a role that you have been playing, perhaps inadvertently or unconsciously, in a way that perpetuates the outcomes that you and so many other people don't want. And this is particularly the case, when we realize that whatever their stated intent, so many systems in our society are actually functioning in a way that reliably produces outcomes that are unfair or that disadvantage people of color, poor people, a variety of other groups that have been just consistently disadvantaged by these systems. And so again, you really want to be thinking about how you show up in those systems, whatever role you occupy, and however uninvolved, or sometimes you may think you're right at the heart of the system, but when you really map it out, you realize that you're not quite at the center and that there's some other dynamics going on. So I mentioned before there are people at MIT that have done a lot with this, and Peter Senge is one of them. This whole field has intrigued folks who have a scientific bent. It's tantalizing in a way, as a way to sort of graphically represent complexity. The challenge is that it's actually, the field of systems thinking is itself really complex, and it's almost like learning a new language. When you look at this page here and everything that's represented here, this literally is symbolic logic, and it is actually a language that you would need to learn to understand how to even represent a system here. And what's on this screen right now is a map of global fishery stocks and how they're interconnected, or all the interconnections that when you're trying to manage a fishing stock, like how many codfish there are in Newfoundland or in the water off Newfoundland. You need to look at all these different things. But you know what? That can kind of like make your head explode. I don't know about you, but sometimes I look at that and I'm just saying, hey, this is more than I want to get into as a change agent. I need something simpler, something that's more immediate and more direct and more approachable. And so that's really where this tool of root cause analysis comes in. We've really found that this tool is a great way to just kind of follow the 80-20 rule to get a lot of the leverage of systems mapping and systems thinking without getting into these incredibly complex maps that are using symbolic logic in a way that's not transparent and not easy for the people around you to understand. Because chances are, and unfortunately this is true, many people who are making social change are not actually using these tools. And so if you actually take the trouble to learn the language of systems logic and mapping, you're going to produce something that most of the people you're working with, won't be able to intuitively understand. But root cause analysis, while it does produce a graphic representation that looks something like this, is actually done in plain English in full sentences, and so it actually flows in a way that you can explain and walk someone through one of these charts, and it's going to, they may question whether your assumptions are right, and that's actually a great reason to walk through it with other people, and actually to produce these with other people, quite frankly. But it's not going to be inscrutable or hard to understand for the people that you're working with. So what are the basic principles of root cause analysis? The first thing is that you start with the system's outputs, right? So again, regardless of what the system says that it's doing, you want to start with what is the result that we're getting out there in the world that we don't want, and let's start there. So, for example, what you see in this chart is that you want to start with like a root problem, which is a plain English sentence. In this case, high-quality student-centered new schools are growing slowly, while low-quality schools easily persist. And this example is something that we produced when we were working in a particular state, and the folks we were working with, and we were trying to understand, like, why is it that new innovative schools are struggling to grow while there's so many schools that really aren't serving students very well, but they just keep going year after year after year. And so sometimes you may have come across this exercise as something called the 5 whys. And you'll see here, the first thing that you do is you start asking why. You get that plain English problem statement, and then you say why. Why is that happening? And again, you want to state the problem in human-centered terms. You want to use nouns and verbs and make a real sentence, right? And then you want to ask why at least 5 times to get down to the root cause and to bedrock. You want to look for feedback loops and look for leverage. So I'm going to actually just walk you through and show you graphically what you get when you use this system. And again, in the downloads that accompany this, there's like a step-by-step instructions that walk you through this, and you can actually also download this image and sort of use this as an example for yourself as you're producing this for yourself. But let me just show you a little more about how this works. So you have this root problem. Again, it's plain English. And you want to just make it simple, but this is really what you want to figure out. Like, what is going on here? Why is this keep happening? So you ask the first why, and in this case, public policies favor the system as it is. Well, why do those public policies favor the system as it is? Because elected officials are not willing to enact different policies. Again, these answers may seem super simple, but you want to make just one leap of logic in between each of these steps. That's important. And again, this is only going to be as good as your leaps of logic. So it is very valuable to do this with a group of people so that you're testing, like, hey, are we sure that that's really true? And then likewise, if you do it, you want to bounce it off of other people, again, to test your logic. Because if there's a break in your chain of logic here, then you're going to get down to a result that may not actually inform you, or you may be off in the leverage point that you identify as a result of all of this. So again, this just keeps going down, why, and sometimes it splits. So in this case, the answer to why elected officials are not willing to enact different policies is twofold. One, interest groups are the dominant influence in the education policy making, right? So interest groups as opposed to the general public. And also, interest groups are supporting the status quo. The interest groups that are supporting the status quo have more power and influence than those that are seeking change, right? And so now we have sort of 2 whys that we have to pursue. We need to look this way about why this is true, and then we also have to follow this one down as well. And what you see as you continue to do this is that you get down to a layer here where, all the way at the bottom you get two unwanted results, right? But here you actually get to a place where you see where this red goes. You get what's called a feedback loop, and and what this says right here is that why. So first of all, we get from interest groups are dominant influence on education policymaking. Well, why is that? Well, it's because the voting public as a whole is not highly engaged on changing public education. So policymaking defaults to being done by organized interest groups. Now, again, you might dispute this. Like this might not be true in your state, or you might think, hey, I don't think that's true. But the point is that you want to make these logical leaps based on evidence, based on what you think is really true. And so then you follow this down one more level. Well, why is the voting public not engaged? Because most voters don't have school-age children, and among the voters who do have kids, they're not exposed to innovative school models that they're really excited about as being relevant for their kids. And why is that? And this is where we get this red feedback loop. And look where this goes, all the way back up to the root problem. The reason that the voting public isn't exposed to these options that they think are valuable for their own students, their own kids, is because high quality student centered new schools are growing slowly. So the supply of them is just not that great. And so what we have here is again what's called a feedback loop. And again, this is where you ask these whys, and then you get down to a level where the answer actually takes you back up to the problem. Okay, and when you intervene at this level, where there are feedback loops, that's where the greatest leverage is going to be for changing this system. And this kind of also explains why you could be working on something for years and years, and if you were operating at a different level than where it doesn't really break this feedback loop, the system may still be robust and continue to produce the unwanted result. So I hope that gives you a sense of just an example of how you can do this. And I promise you, this may seem kind of complex, but it is way less complex than that. Okay, and it actually does really give you real life insight into where you as a change agent and those you're working with can intervene most effectively. And the challenge of not doing something like this is that there are so many opportunities where you could think, hey, there's something here that matters. Why don't we intervene here? But if you're not breaking in those feedback loops, chances are the system is going to remain robust in producing those unwanted results time and time again. So I really encourage you to give this a try. Tackle a problem that really matters to you. Make that root problem statement, and then follow this through. And again, don't worry about getting this like perfectly formed the first time you do it. And the point is that even by doing this, you're going to start gaining insight, really valuable insight about the dynamics of the challenge that you're taking on. And so I really hope that this tool serves you. I know that many of you are working on these complex challenges, and many of you have already identified real leverage points and have a lot of momentum in going after them. But even if you're pretty confident that you're really focused on the greatest leverage intervention point, there's still a benefit to doing this, because I just tell you, you will gain new insight and new perspective, particularly when you take something like this to the folks that you're working with, perhaps in a coalition or a broader constituency, and test it out and see, hey, do you have some different perspective? And do you see some different reason why this thing keeps happening? So again, hope this serves you, and I wish you all the best as you put it to use.
If you like this video and you want to access the worksheet or any other material that goes with it, just click the link below or head on over to joyfulimpact.co. That's the website where we have all the material we use for working with coaching and personal development for change agents. You can set up a free account in the members area, and you can also check out the blog where we have new content coming out all the time. Why are we putting all this out there for free? Because the world has never been more in need of a new greatest generation of change agents. I hope this material is helpful to you, and if it is, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. That will help us spread the word.